The North Atlantic, March 1943. The water is black as oil, churning under a sky heavy with storm clouds. The destroyer's deck trembles beneath the boots of its crew. Below the surface, something moves. Something deadly. The sonar operator's hand freezes over his equipment. Ping, ping, ping. The sound cuts through the engine's roar like a knife. Contact. Submarine. Distance 800 yards and closing. The captain grips the rail, his knuckles white against the cold metal. His breath forms clouds in the freezing air. Around him, sailors scramble to battle stations, their faces pale but determined. They know what's coming. They've trained for this moment, but training never prepares you for the reality of it. The reality that in the next few minutes, some of them might die. The destroyer heels hard to starboard, engine screaming at full power. Water sprays across the bow in sheets of white foam. The submarine is trying to dive, trying to escape into the dark depths where ships cannot follow. But they're too close now. Too close for depth charges. Too close for anything except the oldest, most brutal tactic in naval warfare. The captain's voice cuts through the wind. Prepare to ram. In that split second, they had to choose. Risk their own lives to stop the enemy, knowing that when their ship's hull smashed into the submarine, some would be left to die in the icy water. Knowing that the destroyer itself might be crippled. Knowing that survival for anyone was far from certain. This is not a story about heroes and villains. This is a story about human beings pushed to the absolute limit of courage and desperation. This is a story of the impossible choices made in war and the men who lived and died by them. To understand this moment, you must first understand the ocean itself. The North Atlantic in 1943 was not just a battlefield, it was a killing ground. For nearly 4 years, German U-boats had been hunting Allied convoys like wolves, stalking sheep across a frozen plain. Hundreds of ships had been sent to the bottom. Thousands of men had drowned in water so cold it could kill in minutes. The convoys were lifelines. They carried food, ammunition, fuel, aircraft, tanks. Everything Britain needed to survive. Everything the Allies needed to eventually take the fight back to occupied Europe. Without the convoys, the war was lost, and the U-boats knew it. The submarines would gather in wolf packs, sometimes a dozen or more, coordinating their attacks with brutal efficiency. They would strike at night, surfacing just long enough to fire their torpedoes before disappearing back into the depths. Merchant ships would explode in columns of fire, their hulls torn open, their crews scrambling for lifeboats that might never come. Oil would spread across the water, burning. Men would scream. And then, silence. Against this threat stood the destroyers. Fast, nimble warships designed for one purpose: to hunt submarines and kill them before they could kill again. Their crews were young, most of them barely out of their teens, trained in the brutal calculus of anti-submarine warfare. Track the contact, close the distance, drop depth charges. Listen for the sounds of cracking metal and escaping air that meant a U-boat dying far below. But sometimes depth charges weren't enough. Sometimes the submarine was too close, too shallow, moving too fast. Sometimes there was only one option left. The destroyer in our story was HMS Hesperus, though she could have been any of the dozens of destroyers that patrolled the convoy routes. Her captain was a career naval officer who had spent the first years of the war learning the deadly art of submarine hunting. He was respected by his crew, known for his calm under pressure, his quick decisions, his willingness to take calculated risks. His crew numbered just over 200 men. They came from every corner of Britain and the Commonwealth. Farm boys from Yorkshire, factory workers from Glasgow, fishermen from Cornwall who knew the sea better than they knew the land. They worked 12-hour watches in conditions that would break most men. The cold was relentless, seeping into bones and staying there. Sleep came in snatches, interrupted by battle stations alarms that could sound at any hour. Food was basic, often cold.
The ship rolled constantly in the heavy seas, making even simple tasks exhausting. But they were good at what they did. They had sunk 3 U-boats already that winter. They had saved convoys. They had earned their reputation as one of the most effective submarine hunters in the fleet. Below the waves, in the steel tube of U-191, another crew was fighting their own battle. 50 men, crammed into spaces barely large enough to turn around in. The air was thick with the smell of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, and fear. They had been at sea for 6 weeks, hunting convoys, dodging destroyers, living in constant tension.
These men were not monsters. They were sailors, like the men hunting them. They wrote letters home to wives and mothers. They carried photographs of children they had not seen in months. They joked and complained and dreamed of shore leave. They were humans, caught in the machinery of war, following orders, trying to survive. Their captain was a veteran of the U-boat war, decorated for bravery, respected for bringing his crew home alive mission after mission. He knew the odds. He knew that the life expectancy of a U-boat crew had dropped dramatically as Allied anti-submarine tactics improved. He knew that every time they went to sea, there was a good chance they would not return. And now, on this cold March morning, those odds had caught up with them. The Hesperus had been escorting a convoy for 3 days when the contact came. 40 merchant ships, spread across miles of ocean, laden with cargo vital to the war effort. 2 destroyers and a corvette for protection. Not enough, never enough, but it was all they had. The sonar operator had been at his post for 7 hours straight, eyes burning, ears straining for any sound that didn't belong. The ocean was never quiet. Whales sang, ice creaked, the ship's own engines created a constant background roar, but he was trained to filter all that out, to listen for the one sound that mattered. And then he heard it. A mechanical whine, faint but distinct. Propeller noise. Submarine propeller noise. His call to the bridge was calm, professional, but his heart was hammering. Contact bearing 270, range 1,000 yards, moving left to right. On the bridge, the captain's mind was already racing through possibilities. Range and bearing suggested the U-boat was positioning for an attack on the convoy. It was still submerged but shallow, probably at periscope depth, lining up its shot. They had minutes, maybe less. He grabbed the voice pipe. "Engine room, give me everything you've got. All stations, action stations. Prepare depth charges." The destroyer surged forward, her engines pushed to their limits. On deck, sailors ran to their positions. The depth charge crews readied their weapons, heavy barrels filled with high explosives, set to detonate at specific depths. The gun crews manned their weapons, knowing they would be useless unless the submarine surfaced. Below, in the U-boat, the hydrophone operator heard the destroyer's engines change pitch. His face went pale. "Destroyer accelerating, bearing directly for us." The U-boat captain's response was instant. "Take us down, emergency dive full ahead." But they were too shallow. The submarine's bow tilted down, stern rising, as compressed air was blown from the ballast tanks and seawater rushed in. The crew grabbed handholds as the deck angled beneath them. Equipment that wasn't secured slid and clattered. The depth gauge needle swung downward. 50 feet, 60, 70. Not fast enough. On the Hesperus, the sonar operator's voice was urgent now. "Contact range 500 yards. She's diving but still shallow." The captain made his decision in seconds. At this range, depth charges would be ineffective. The submarine would be past them before the charges could sink deep enough to detonate at the right depth. The U-boat would escape, disappear into the deep water, and surface later to attack the convoy. Unless... Hard to starboard, increase to flank speed, all hands brace for collision. The order went through the ship like an electric shock. Brace for collision. Every sailor knew what that meant. They grabbed rails, pipes, anything bolted down. In the engine room, stokers fed the boilers frantically, giving the turbines every ounce of steam they could produce. The destroyer turned, heeling so hard that water washed across her deck. Her bow came around, pointing directly at the position where the sonar showed the submarine trying to dive. The distance closed with terrifying speed. 400 yards, 300, 200. The captain could see the water ahead churning, disturbed by the submarine's dive. A boil of foam marked where the submarine's conning tower had just disappeared. They were aiming at that spot, a collision course with an enemy they could not see, only hear. Only hope they had calculated correctly. In the U-boat, the captain knew. He could hear the destroyer's propellers, louder and louder, a roar like an approaching freight train. He could do nothing. They were committed to the dive now. Bringing the boat back up would take precious seconds they did not have. All he could do was brace himself and pray. 100 yards. 50. The crew of the Hesperus could not see nothing but ocean ahead. They were aiming at sonar echoes, at mathematics, at faith that their calculations were correct. Some men closed their eyes, others stared, transfixed. The bow cut through the water like a blade. And then, impact.
The sound was beyond description. Metal screaming against metal. A shudder that ran through the entire ship, throwing men from their feet. The destroyer's bow rode up, lifted by the force of collision, then crashed back down. Below, her keel had struck the submarine's pressure hull just aft of the conning tower. A glancing blow, but devastating. In the U-boat, the world became chaos. The impact threw men against bulkheads. Lights shattered, pipes burst, spraying high-pressure water. Somewhere aft, the pressure hull had cracked. Seawater was flooding in, tons of it, unstoppable. The captain pulled himself up, blood running from a gash on his forehead. Around him, his crew was scrambling, trying to assess damage, trying to save their ship. But he could feel it. The boat was mortally wounded. The stern was already heavier, sinking. They had minutes at most. "Surface," he shouted. "Emergency blow, all tanks. Get us up." Compressed air screamed into the ballast tanks, forcing water out. The U-boat's bow lifted, angling up toward the light above, but the stern continued to sink, dragged down by the flooding compartments. The boat was rising, but not fast enough, not evenly. On the Hesperus, damage control teams were assessing their own injuries. The bow was crumpled, plates buckled, but the hull was intact. They were taking water, but not critically. They could still fight, still move. The sonar operator's voice. "Contact breaking surface, bearing Del ahead." The submarine erupted from the water like a dying whale, her conning tower appearing first, then her deck, water streaming from her hull. But she was wrong, all wrong. Her stern was still underwater, her bow pointed at the sky at an impossible angle. She was sinking. The Hesperus's gun crews opened fire immediately. Small caliber rounds stitched across the submarine's hull. Not to sink her, she was already sinking, but to prevent her deck gun from being manned, to keep her crew from returning fire. And now the crew was emerging. The forward hatch flew open, and men poured out, desperate, knowing they had seconds to escape before their boat took them down with her. They wore their life jackets, those who had time to grab them. They jumped into the water without hesitation, because staying aboard meant certain death. The U-boat's stern settled deeper. Water washed across her deck, reaching toward the conning tower. Men were still climbing out, helping wounded shipmates, some jumping, some sliding down the angled hull into the sea. And then she went. The stern dropped, the bow lifted higher, and U-191 slid backward into the ocean. The sound was a roar of escaping air, the death cry of a submarine. Men still clinging to her hull were pulled under in the suction. Others swam desperately away, trying to escape the pull of the sinking vessel. In less than a minute, she was gone. Only wreckage remained. Debris floated to the surface. Wooden planks, life jackets, personal items, and men. Dozens of men scattered across 100 yards of ocean, treading water, clinging to wreckage, calling out for help that might not come. The water temperature was 38 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, even a strong swimmer would lose consciousness in 15 to 30 minutes. Death would follow soon after from hypothermia. They were dying already, these German sailors, dying from the moment they hit the water. On the Hesperus, the crew watched in silence. They had won.
They had sunk a U-boat, eliminated a threat to the convoy, done their duty. But there was no cheering, no celebration, because below them, in the water, men were dying. The captain stared down at the survivors. He could see their faces, white with cold and fear. Some were waving, calling out in German. Others just floated, already too weak to move. He had perhaps 30 men in the water, maybe more. Most of the U-boat's crew of 50, sinking fast into hypothermia. Protocol was clear. The convoy was still in danger. There could be other U-boats nearby. Stopping to pick up survivors meant making his ship a stationary target. It meant putting his own crew at risk. The accepted practice was to note the position, alert rescue vessels if any were available, and continue the mission. But there were no rescue vessels. The convoy escorts were stretched thin. By the time anyone else could reach this position, everyone in the water would be dead. The captain felt the weight of every eye on him. His officers waited for orders. His crew waited, and below, in the water, men waited to learn if they would live or die. He thought of his own crew, young men, many of them, who trusted him to bring them home. If he stopped to pick up survivors and another U-boat was nearby, they could be torpedoed. His ship could be sunk. His men could end up in the same water, dying the same death.
He thought of the convoy, the merchant ships counting on his protection. Every minute spent here was a minute he wasn't screening them from attack. He thought of the men in the water. Enemy sailors, yes. Men who had been trying to kill British sailors just minutes before. But men nonetheless. Fathers. Sons. Brothers. Drowning in ice water because he had done his duty and sunk their boat. In the water, a young German sailor clung to a piece of wreckage. He was 19 years old. He had joined the Kriegsmarine because his father had been a sailor in the First World War, and he wanted to make him proud. He had a girlfriend back home who wrote him letters every week. He could feel the cold seeping into his body, numbing his fingers, making his legs heavy. He looked up at the destroyer looming above him and wondered if they would leave him here to die. Next to him, an older sailor, a chief petty officer with 20 years of service, was trying to help a wounded man stay afloat. The wounded man was unconscious, a head injury from the collision, blood seeping into the water. The chief knew the man would die soon, but he held him anyway, because that's what you did. You didn't leave your shipmates behind, even when it was hopeless. On the destroyer's deck, a young British sailor stared down at them. He was 20 years old, from a small village in Devon. He had joined the Navy to fight Germans, to defend his country, to do his part. He had been taught that the enemy was the enemy, that they were trying to kill him and his mates, that there could be no mercy in war. But looking at the men in the water, he didn't see enemies. He saw sailors. Men like himself, caught in something bigger than any of them. Men who were going to die if someone didn't help them. He looked at his captain, willing him to give the order. Pick them up. Save them. Show that even in war, even after killing, there could be humanity. The captain's decision took 30 seconds, though it felt like an hour. 30 seconds of weighing duty against mercy, mission against humanity, the possible against the certain. "All stop," he said quietly. "Prepare to recover survivors. Gun crews remain at action stations. Sonar, continuous watch. If you get even a hint of another contact, you sing out immediately." The order went through the ship. Relief for some, anxiety for others. They were stopping, making themselves vulnerable, but they were also doing the right thing, and every man aboard knew it. Lines were thrown down, scramble nets were deployed over the side. The crew of the Hesperus became rescuers, reaching down to pull up men who had been their enemies minutes before. It was harder than it looked. The German sailors were soaked, heavy, many too weak to help themselves. Some had to be secured with lines and hauled up bodily. Others managed to climb the nets but collapsed on deck immediately, their strength completely gone. The ship's medical officer and his assistants worked frantically. Hypothermia cases needed to be warmed slowly, carefully, or the shock could kill them. Wet clothes had to be removed, dry blankets provided, hot liquids given if the men were conscious.
The wounded needed treatment, though supplies were limited. It took 20 minutes to recover all the survivors they could find. 20 minutes of the destroyer sitting still in water that might hold other submarines. 20 minutes of every man on watch staring at the sonar, horizon, waiting for a periscope or a torpedo wake that could end their mercy mission in fire and death. They pulled 32 men from the water, 32 out of 50. The rest were gone, pulled under with the submarine or already dead from the cold. 36 dead, 32 alive. Below decks, the German sailors huddled under blankets, shivering uncontrollably as their bodies tried to re-warm. Some were conscious and aware, staring around at the British sailors with expressions mixing gratitude, confusion, and lingering fear. Others were semi-conscious, moaning softly, lost in the grip of hypothermia and shock.
The British crew moved among them with careful efficiency. There was no hatred in their actions, but no great warmth either. These were men they had just tried to kill, men whose submarine had been hunting convoys, sinking ships, drowning British sailors. The moral calculus of rescue didn't erase that fact. One of the German officers, the U-boat's executive officer, regained consciousness, wrapped in blankets with a British sailor standing guard. He tried to speak, but his teeth were chattering too hard. The British sailor handed him a cup of hot tea, sweetened heavily. The German took it with shaking hands, sipped, felt the warmth spreading through him. "Thank you," he managed in English. "Thank you for saving us." The British sailor nodded, but said nothing. What was there to say? "You're welcome for not letting you freeze to death after we destroyed your boat and killed your friends?" The German officer looked around at his crew, mentally counting heads, realizing how many were missing. His captain was there, alive but injured, the chief engineer, the radio operator. So many gone. Men he had served with for 2 years, shared a steel tube with across thousands of miles of ocean, dead now, their bodies settling into the cold depths or floating somewhere in the current. He thought about the moment of impact, the sound of the destroyer's keel smashing through their hull, the instant when he knew their boat was finished, the scramble to get as many men out as possible before she sank, the cold shock of hitting the water, the desperate swim away from the sinking submarine, looking up and wondering if the British would just leave them there. He had expected to die. Every U-boat sailor expected to die. The statistics were brutal. By 1943, the U-boat service had the highest casualty rate of any branch of the German military. 3 out of 4 U-boats sent on patrol would not return. The men who served on them knew this, accepted it, and went to sea anyway. But he hadn't expected to be saved by the men who sank him. That wasn't how this war worked. Ships were sunk, men drowned. That was the calculus of naval warfare. Mercy was a luxury few could afford. On the bridge, the captain wrote up his action report. 1 U-boat sunk by ramming, 32 prisoners taken, own ship damaged but operational, convoy proceeding on course, mission successful. But he kept thinking about the 18 men they couldn't save, the ones who had died in the water while his ship sat there, unable to reach them all in time. The ones who had been pulled under when the submarine sank, the faces he had seen in the water, white with cold, disappearing beneath the surface. He had made the right decision. He knew that intellectually. He had saved whom he could without unnecessarily risking his ship and crew. He had balanced duty with mercy as best as any man could. But knowing you made the right decision didn't make it easier to live with. His first officer joined him on the bridge. They stood together in silence for a moment, watching the gray sea roll past. "You did right, sir," stopping for them. "Some wouldn't have." The captain nodded. "Some would say I was wrong to stop at all, that I risked the ship and crew for the enemy." "Maybe,
But they're not just the enemy, are they? They're sailors, like us. That was exactly it. That was the complexity, the moral ambiguity that war created. These men were the enemy. They had been trying to sink British ships, kill British sailors, strangle Britain with a blockade. They were legitimate targets, valid kills. But they were also human beings, with families and fears and hopes, who deserved mercy when they could no longer fight. War demanded that you kill without hesitation when necessary, but did it also demand that you watch men drown when you could save them? Where was the line between military necessity and basic humanity? And who got to decide where that line was drawn? The captain had made his choice. He would have to live with it, whatever the consequences. If his superiors criticized him for stopping, for risking his ship and crew, he would accept that. If the families of his crew questioned whether he had put their sons and brothers at risk for the enemy, he would understand. But he would not regret pulling those men from the water. He would not regret choosing mercy when mercy was possible. The convoy reached port 4 days later without further incident. The damaged destroyer was detached for repairs. The German prisoners were transferred to a POW camp. Official reports were filed. The war went on. But for the men who had been there, who had lived through those minutes of violence and mercy, the memory stayed. The British sailors remembered the faces of the men they pulled from the water. The German survivors remembered the hands reaching down to save them. Both remembered the moment when the lines between friend and enemy, between duty and humanity, became blurred.
In the grand scheme of the war, this encounter was a footnote. One submarine among hundreds sunk, one destroyer among thousands that fought. A minor engagement in a war of millions. But for the men involved, it was everything. It was life and death. It was the moment when they had to decide what kind of men they were, what kind of war they were fighting, what humanity meant when humanity was the enemy. After the war, some of the German survivors tried to find information about the destroyer that sank them and saved them. They wanted to thank the captain, to let him know what his decision had meant. A few succeeded, making contact through veterans organizations and Red Cross channels. Letters were exchanged. Old enemies became, if not friends, then at least men who understood each other. One of the German officers who survived wrote in his memoir years later, "We were enemies that day, fighting a war neither of us had started, following orders neither of us could question. They sank our boat, they killed our friends. That was war, and we accepted it. But then they stopped. They took the risk. They pulled us from the water when they could have sailed away. That was humanity, and it saved us. I have lived 60 years since that day, married, raised children, seen grandchildren, all because a British captain decided that even enemies deserve mercy." The captain of the Hesperus never spoke much about the incident. When asked, he would say simply that he did what any decent man would do, that the war was about defeating an enemy, not about letting men freeze to death when they could be saved, that there had to be limits, even in war, to what you were willing to let happen. He died in 1987, an old man who had lived through more war than most could imagine. At his funeral, among the mourners were 3 elderly German men who had traveled from Germany to pay their respects. They were the last survivors of U-191, the men he had pulled from the water 44 years earlier. They stood at attention as the coffin was carried past, saluting the man who had sunk their submarine and saved their lives, the enemy captain who had shown them that humanity could survive even in the depths of war. This story raises questions that have no easy answers. In war, we are taught to think in absolutes, friend or enemy, victory or defeat, kill or be killed. But the reality is far more complex. The men who fought in the Battle of the Atlantic were all caught in a conflict not of their making, following orders, trying to survive, doing what they believed was right. The U-boat crews were not monsters. They were sailors doing their duty as they understood it, following the orders of their government, fighting for their country. Many of them had no love for the Nazi regime, but fought anyway, because that's what soldiers and sailors do. They were brave men facing terrible odds, knowing that most of them would not survive the war. The destroyer crews were not saints. They killed without hesitation when necessary, sank submarines and sent men to their deaths, because that was their mission. They couldn't afford mercy during an attack. They couldn't risk their ships and convoys for the enemy. War demanded ruthlessness, and they provided it. But in the aftermath, in the moment after the killing stopped, there was a choice. Leave the survivors to die, which was tactically sound and militarily justifiable, or stop and save them, which was tactically risky and militarily questionable. There was no right answer, no official doctrine that covered every situation. Each captain had to decide for himself where duty ended and humanity began. Some chose duty. They noted the position of survivors and kept moving, prioritizing their mission, protecting their own crews and the convoys they escorted. This was neither cruel nor cowardly. It was a legitimate decision based on military necessity and the calculus of risk. Many men in the water died because of such decisions, but many more sailors and convoys lived because the escorts kept moving, kept protecting, kept doing their primary job.
Some chose humanity. These stopped, took the risk, pulled men from the water who had been their enemies minutes before. This was neither foolish nor weak. It was a legitimate decision based on the belief that there had to be limits, that humanity had to mean something even in war, that you didn't let men freeze to death when you could save them. Some of these rescuing ships were attacked during recovery operations, paid a price for their mercy, but most were not. Most saved lives without losing their own. The captain of the Hesperus chose humanity, but he did so carefully, maintaining watch, keeping his ship ready to move instantly if another threat appeared. He saved whom he could without needlessly endangering his crew. It was a balanced choice, threading the needle between duty and mercy. Would you have made the same choice? If you were the captain, standing on that bridge, looking down at men drowning in ice water, knowing that saving them meant risking your own crew, what would you have done? It's easy to judge from the comfort of peacetime, but in that moment, in the cold reality of war, the decision was never simple. This is why this story matters. Not because it's unique, there were dozens of similar incidents during the Battle of the Atlantic. Moments when enemies became rescuers, when mercy survived despite the killing. But because it forces us to confront the moral complexity of war. It reminds us that the men who fought were human beings making impossible choices under terrible pressure. It shows us that courage comes in many forms. The courage to attack and sink the enemy, and the courage to stop and save them afterward. War brings out the worst in humanity. It creates situations where killing is necessary, where mercy can be fatal, where survival depends on treating other humans as targets to be destroyed. But war can also bring out the best in humanity. The bravery of men facing death without flinching, the selflessness of sailors helping wounded shipmates escape a sinking submarine, the compassion of enemies choosing to save rather than abandon each other. The men of the Hesperus and U-191 were caught in the machinery of war, but they were not crushed by it. They remembered that they were human beings first and enemies second. They did their duty, fighting, sinking, killing when necessary, but they also preserved their humanity by showing mercy when they could. That is the lesson of this story. That even in the darkest moments of human conflict, when nations are trying to destroy each other and individual lives seem meaningless against the scale of war, humanity can survive. Not always, not easily, but it can survive if men choose to let it. If they decide that some lines will not be crossed, that some things matter more than tactical advantage or military necessity. The 32 men pulled from the water that day went home after the war. They lived lives, raised families, grew old. They existed because one captain decided that letting them drown was a step too far, a sacrifice of humanity he was not willing to make. And in making that choice, he proved that war, for all its horrors and moral compromises, does not have to destroy everything good in us, that courage and mercy can coexist, that enemies can become the saved, and the saved can become grateful, and in the end, we are all just human beings trying to survive the storms we find ourselves in, whether those storms are made of water or of war.